Good day, everyone, and welcome to another Oklahoma Municipal Assurance Group informational session. Today's session will focus on trauma-informed sexual assault response and intervention. My name is Kevin McCullough, and I'm your OMAG law enforcement specialist, and I will be your facilitator for today's virtual meeting. And again, welcome. This training is created by the Oklahoma Municipal Assurance Group, and the opinions contained herein are those of the authors. You can learn more about us at www.omag.org. You can look at our menu and then click on About Us or Publications or Free Services, or you can explore the I Want To menu. Today's broadcast is a cooperative effort brought to you by the Oklahoma Municipal Assurance Group, the Oklahoma Association of Chiefs of Police, and the Oklahoma Municipal Management Services. You can learn more about OMAG, OACP, and OMMS by visiting our websites at omag.org, okchiefs.org, and okmms.org. The purpose of today's training is to review guidelines for the investigation of sexual assaults. These guidelines will address some of the unique aspects of such cases and the effects that these crimes have on the victims. Just a little bit of housekeeping when it comes to today's session. This course has been approved by CLEET for 1 hour of continuing education credit. Handouts should be provided by your agency training officer or can be requested via email. Questions can be submitted to me via email at kmccullough@omag.org. My contact information will be supplied at the end of this session. And now it's time to get into trauma-informed sexual assault response and intervention. In 2019, Oklahoma passed legislation which established a continuing education mandate for Oklahoma peace officers that required training focused on policies and protocols for responding to sexual assault calls, guidelines for the collection and maintenance of sexual assault kits, and trauma-informed sexual assault response and intervention. This mandate went into effect on November 1st, 2019. CLEET now requires 1 hour of continuing education on this topic annually. I might mention that at the same time, the Oklahoma legislature passed another continuing education mandate for Oklahoma peace officers, which required training on the investigation of unidentified and missing persons, also known as Francine's Law. Now let's get into the information on trauma-informed sexual assault response and intervention. First, let's cover a couple of definitions that we will be using during this session. Sexual assault means any crime or attempted crime of a sexual nature, to include, but not limited to, offenses defined in Title 21, Chapter 45 of the Oklahoma State Statutes. Sexual Assault Response Team, or SART, is a multidisciplinary team generally comprised of advocates, law enforcement officers, forensic medical examiners, including sexual assault nurse examiners, or SANEs, if possible, forensic laboratory personnel, and prosecutors. The team is designed to coordinate a broad response to sexual assault victims. A trauma-informed approach increases victims feeling supported in the criminal justice process and results in them being more likely to continue to engage with the criminal justice process, which increases the ability of law enforcement to hold offenders accountable, better able to provide information about the incident, less likely to experience re-traumatization or secondary trauma, more satisfied with the outcome of the case regardless of whether the perpetrator is convicted due to feeling believed and supported by criminal justice professionals. Justice is in the eyes of the victim, and convicting or taking the offender to trial might not be justice in the victim's eyes. When responding to reports of sexual assaults, officers must strive to minimize the trauma experienced by the victims and should aggressively investigate sexual assaults, pursue expeditious apprehension and conviction of perpetrators, and protect the safety of the victims and the community. It is easy to overlook the fact that the dispatcher or call taker may be the first person with whom the victim comes into contact with your agency. As such, it is vitally important that these individuals are prepared to address evidentiary considerations while thoughtfully responding to a victim who may be in crisis. Following dispatch, the responding officer also has an opportunity to create an impression on the victim. The responding officer should be compassionate and professional, as well as flexible in adapting to the needs of the victim. For example, if the victim wants a friend or family member present as a support system, the officer should respect their decision. The responding officer should explain that they have a body-worn camera and ask if the victim prefers the camera to be turned on or turned off. Ensure the victim's immediate physical safety and health. Transport the victim to an appropriate exam if the victim agrees to one. The officer should emphasize that the victim's health is the priority of the exam, not the investigation. Explain that the victim will not be responsible for paying for the exam and explain your local procedures. Ask about strangulation and suffocation and provide medical care if there is any indication of either. Connect the victim with services. Have an agency or a community-based advocate with you during this initial response whenever possible. Have the advocate clarify victim confidentiality and privacy rights. Have the advocate develop a safety plan with the victim. Explain reporting options and next steps if the victim is not able to participate at this time. Depending on your agency's policy, reporting options may include making an anonymous report or an incident report with the possibility of investigation at a later time. Include if and how the victim has control over the process and flow of the investigation, and if they can suspend the investigation at any time. Reassure or explain that you are not investigating the victim for any illegal behavior like underage drinking or sex work, and that such information may be important to the investigation. For example, to show the victim's vulnerability and that the perpetrator exploited. Have translation services available. Use only interpreters certified in the language spoken by the victim. Do not use a child, family member, or neighbor as a translator. And conduct a preliminary victim interview. The preliminary victim interview should build a rapport with the victim while seeking to determine whether their report meets the elements of a crime. Be conducted out of earshot and eyesight of others, including children, unless the victim requests support. Be in a place the victim feels comfortable. Be brief while still allowing the victim the time they need to discuss what happened and provide context. Identify co-occurring crimes such as stalking, false imprisonment, strangulation, property damage, threats, and other crimes. Identify who the perpetrator was and the victim's relationship to them if known. We should also identify witnesses. Law enforcement officers can make a positive impression on victims through expressing concern, using phrases such as, "I'm sorry this happened to you," or "You are not alone. How can we help you?" These phrases not only are humanizing and show compassion, but also acknowledge to the victim that something traumatic happened and that their report will be taken seriously. Similarly, encouraging victims to ask questions at the beginning and throughout if they need clarification shows compassion and respect. Part of building rapport and creating connection with a victim is listening with compassion and showing concern. This can increase victims' feelings that their report is taken seriously and decrease feelings that they are being judged. Qualified investigators should be available for assignment of sexual assault investigations. These investigators should have specialized training in and be familiar with interview techniques and the medical and legal issues that are specific to sexual assault investigations. Conduct follow-up interviews and investigations. Present appropriate cases of alleged sexual assault to the prosecutor for review. Coordinate with other enforcement agencies, social service agencies, and medical personnel as needed. Provide referrals to therapy services, victim advocates, and support for the victim. Participate in or coordinate with SART or other multidisciplinary investigative teams as applicable. In all reported or suspected cases of sexual assault, a report should be written and assigned for follow-up investigation. This includes incidents which allegations appear unfounded or unsubstantiated. The preliminary consideration in sexual assault investigations, which begin with the initial call to law enforcement agency, should be the health and safety of the victim, the preservation of evidence, and preliminary interviews to determine if a crime has been committed and to attempt to identify the suspect. Whenever possible, a member of the SART should be included in the initial victim interviews. An in-depth follow-up interview should not be conducted until after the medical and forensic examinations are completed and personal needs of the victim have been met. The follow-up interview may be delayed to the following day based upon the circumstances. Whenever practicable, the follow-up interview should be conducted by a qualified investigator. We should allow the information and evidence to guide the investigation, just as officers are trained to do with every other crime. This is particularly important for the first responding officers to remember when interacting with victims of sexual assault because of the myths, misperceptions, and biases that victims, friends, family, and law enforcement have all been exposed to as members of society. When following the evidence, whether it be physical, sensory, or emotional, to establish whether the elements of the crime were met, it is vital to recognize the impact of trauma and that a victim could show a variety of emotions when reporting the crime, including any of those listed on the slide, or even many of them. Remember, there is no one way or right way people react to traumatic events, and there are no perfect victims. One of the many misperceptions around sexual assault cases and victims' reactions and behaviors is how a real victim acts with respect to a real sexual assault. Because, as we know, the idea that there is a right way to react is just a myth. After expressing compassion for the victim and inviting them to ask questions when or if they have any, start to gain more information with questions such as, where would you like to start? Or would you tell me what you're able to about your experience? This sets a supportive tone and invites the victim to describe what happened, their thoughts, and their feelings in their own words, which is valuable evidence to document in the report. While establishing the elements of the crime and the facts of the case, the officer should avoid language that may be perceived as blaming the victim or expressing doubt. If victims feel blamed or that they are not believed, it is more likely that they will lose trust in criminal justice professionals and disengage from the process. Using open-ended questions and requests gives the person being interviewed the opportunity to share more information about what they are able to recall. For victims, this method helps their brain retrieve information from a traumatic event and offers them more control as they recount a time when they were violated and had no control. This means that, in general, we should avoid the following types of questions. Questions would start with why, because victims may perceive this as asking for justification and or that it's their fault that they did or did not do something. Why did you? Why didn't you? Directives such as explain to me. Requests for a chronological account with prompts such as, and then what happened next? Asking questions including why or explain to me can sound to the victim like the officer is asking for justification of what happened, which could be perceived as faulting the victim for taking or not taking a certain action. Additionally, trauma impacts the encoding of details that did not seem central to survival, such as timeline. Therefore, asking for a chronological account can increase the victim's confusion as they try to comply. We allow the victim to start and stop where they choose. One thought may trigger a new memory and take the victim back to a different point in the assault. This may be difficult to document, but it's important for an accurate account. Law enforcement should frame questions around, "Are you able to tell me about?" and use the words or description that the victim used to describe the event. So if the victim uses certain terminology, we would utilize that same language when asking questions. Since we know that emotion and sensory-based memories are more strongly encoded during a traumatic event, asking a victim about their feelings, thoughts, and five senses helps the victim recall those memories. Asking a victim about their thought process provides an opportunity for them to explain why they did or did not do something and why. For example, "Why didn't you leave?" could be reframed as, "When he went to get the condom, what were you thinking?" The question provides the opportunity for the victim to explain their thought process. They might say, "I was scared that he would hurt me if I tried to leave, and I felt like I couldn't move or even scream." This might explain why they did not leave and also illustrate that they may have experienced the common freeze response or tonic immobility. The cascade of hormones released during a traumatic event can lead to a variety of fear responses such as fight, flight, or that tonic immobility or temporary paralysis. Asking victims what they felt, thought, smelled, heard, tasted, and saw can uncover some of the peripheral, non-central details that were not encoded or remembered, as well to lead to important evidence that can be corroborated by subsequent investigation. Now, here are more examples of questions that might be perceived as victim blaming and ways that they can be reframed, explaining why you are asking that question. Asking, "What were you wearing?" may be perceived by the victim as the officer is blaming them for the assault due to their attire. And the victim is responsible for the attack because of what they were wearing. Instead, officers should reframe this question as on the slide, explaining that gathering clothing, sheets, towels, and other items is part of evidence collection process and removes the victim's specific experience from the equation, instead focusing on the process. Asking, "Were you drinking or taking drugs?" may be perceived by the victim as if the officer is implying that what happened to the victim happened to them because they were drinking alcohol or using drugs. Additionally, victims may be afraid that there will be ramifications, possibly criminal, for their actions, and so they may hesitate to admit it to law enforcement, especially if they are underage and or the drug use was illegal. Instead, officers should reframe the question as we have there on the slide. This explanation makes it clear to the victim that their safety and well-being is most important. It also serves to reassure the victim that you are not concerned about the drinking or the drug use, or that they would be charged with any of these behaviors. This is applicable for other illegal behaviors as well, such as sex work. Now here you see the IACP's resource. This is the quick reference guide to trauma-informed interviewing. And this actual resource, this tool will be included in your handouts. This provides interviewing techniques and guides for additional questions to assist law enforcement in conducting trauma-informed interviews. Now, victims are often reluctant or even embarrassed to discuss details. Recanting or changing one or more aspect of a prior statement is not necessarily an indication of false reporting or that the case is unfounded. If the responding officer has reason to believe the incident may be without merit, the officer should document the evidence and inconsistencies. Due to physical and emotional trauma and the myths of stereotypes associated with sexual assault, inconsistencies in the victim's report are not uncommon. No opinions of whether the case is unfounded should be included in the report. Victims are not to be required or even asked if they would take a polygraph examination. Victims should be apprised of applicable victim rights provisions as outlined in state statute and should be addressed in your victim or witness assistance policy. Whenever possible, a SART member should be involved in the collection of forensic evidence from the victim. When the facts of the case indicate that collection of biological evidence is warranted, it should be collected regardless of how much time has elapsed since the reported assault. If a drug-facilitated sexual assault is suspected, it is critical to the investigation that a urine sample from the victim is collected by a medical professional. If resources allow, kits or biological evidence from all rape cases, including cases where the suspect is known by the victim, should be submitted for biological testing. The result and the case information should be entered into the state and national registries in a timely manner. Victims who choose not to file a police report may desire to provide an anonymous rape kit. In these circumstances, the rape kit shall be completed and stored according to the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation procedures for collecting and handling of anonymous rape kits. All evidence from cases where the suspect is a stranger to the victim shall be transmitted in a timely manner to the proper forensics lab for processing all relevant biological evidence. If the assigned investigator has reason to believe the case is without merit, the case may be classified as unfounded only upon the review and approval of the investigator's supervisor. Classification of a rape case as unfounded requires the supervisor to determine that the facts have significant irregularities with the reported information and that the incident could not have happened as it was reported. When a victim has recanted his or her original statement, there must be corroborating evidence to support the recanted information before the case should be determined as unfounded. A supervisor must ensure case dispositions are reviewed on a periodic basis using an identified group that is independent of the investigation process. The SART and/or victim advocates should be considered for involvement in this audit. In cases where the perpetrator is not known to the victim, and especially if there are multiple crimes where more than one appear to be related, consideration should be given to releasing information to the public whenever there is a reasonable likelihood that doing so may result in developing helpful investigative leads. A supervisor should weigh the risk of alerting the suspect to the investigation with the need to protect the victim and the public and to prevent more crimes. Officers must ensure that crime victims and witnesses receive appropriate assistance and that they are provided with information from government and private resources, and that their agency meets all related legal mandates. Officers should also provide guidance and assistance to the victim and witnesses of crime. It is imperative that officers show compassion and understanding for victims and witnesses and will make reasonable efforts to provide the support and required information. Your chief law enforcement officer of your agency may appoint a member of the agency to serve as a crime victim liaison. The crime victim liaison will be the point of contact for individuals requiring further assistance or information from the agency regarding benefits from crime victim resources. This person shall also be responsible for maintaining compliance with all legal mandates related to crime victims and/or witnesses. Officers should provide all victims with applicable victim information handouts as addressed in Title 21. Officers should never guarantee a victim's safety from future harm, but may make practical safety suggestions to victims who express fear of future harm or retaliation. Officers should never guarantee that a person qualifies as a victim for the purpose of compensation or restitution, but may direct them to the proper written material or available victims' resources. Family members who receive a death notification in a case of a homicide are entitled to receive notification of their rights as a crime victim. If the preliminary investigation involves a case of domestic abuse, the investigating member shall assess the potential danger to the victim by asking questions provided on a lethality assessment form. Officers investigating cases of domestic abuse, stalking, harassment, rape, or forcible sodomy shall ensure the victim is provided the appropriate handout containing a petition for an emergency temporary order of protection, and, if necessary, assist the victim in completing the petition form. If the court is closed and a petition is desired and completed, the investigating officer shall, as soon as practicable, notify a judge by phone and describe the circumstances. The officer shall then tell the victim whether the judge has approved or disapproved the order. If approved, the officer shall provide the victim or a responsible adult, if the victim is a minor child or an incompetent person, with a copy of the petition and a written statement signed by the officer attesting that the judge has approved the order. We notify the person subject to an approved order of the issuance and conditions of the order, if known, and provide him or her with a copy of the petition and the statement of the officer attesting to the order of the judge. We file a petition and supporting statements with the court when it is first open for business. The chief law enforcement officer for your agency shall ensure victim information handouts are available and current. These should include, as appropriate, shelters and other community resources for victims of domestic abuse, community resources for victims of sexual assault, assurance that sexual assault victims will not incur out-of-pocket expenses for forensic medical exams, an advisement that a person who is arrested may be released on bond or some other form of release, and that the victim should not rely upon an arrest as a guarantee of safety. A clear explanation of relevant court orders and how they can be obtained. A petition for an emergency temporary order of protection shall be included in the handout. The chief law enforcement officer of your agency shall also make sure the handouts are available and current and include, as appropriate, information regarding available compensation for qualifying victims of crime, VINE information, including telephone number and whether this free service is available, to allow victims to check on an offender's custody status and to register for automatic notification when a person is released from jail. Notice regarding U-Visa and T-Visa application process. Resources available for victims of identity theft. A place for the officer's name, badge number, and any applicable case or incident number. Explanation of the address confidentiality program and how it can be initiated. The 24-hour Oklahoma Safeline telephone number for victims of rape, forcible sodomy, or domestic abuse. And rights specific to victims of domestic abuse and rights specific to victims of rape and forcible sodomy set forth in Title 21. Officers should never guarantee a witness's safety from future harm or that his or her identity will always remain confidential. Officers may make practical safety suggestions to witnesses who express fear of future harm or retaliation. Officers should investigate allegations of witness intimidation and take enforcement action when lawful and reasonable. As we have covered in this session, first responding officers play a crucial role in supporting victims of sexual assault and holding perpetrators accountable. First impressions matter, and we know that how victims feel about their initial report and interactions with first responding officers plays a huge role in whether or not they decide to participate in the criminal justice process. Follow-up investigations, identifying, collecting, and preserving evidence are also critical pieces of the puzzle in seeking justice and holding a perpetrator accountable. It is vital for officers to remember that the victim already has an impression and opinions about officers, and they likely won't distinguish the responding officers from others they've encountered in the past, seen on TV, or read about in social media. It is similarly vital for officers to remember that victims, their friends and family, witnesses, and officers themselves have preconceived assumptions, expectations, and judgments around sexual assault, but it is the officer's duty to listen and to let the evidence guide the investigation. When following the evidence to establish whether the elements of the crime were met, it is vital to proceed in a trauma-informed way, treating victims with compassion, ensuring victims' immediate safety and health, connecting victims with services, and remembering the impact of trauma. Now, before we end today's session, I want to make sure that if you have any feedback on what you liked or disliked, or what you would like to see discussed in a new class, or if you have a topic that you would like to present, please type that information into the chat function, or you can send those questions, concerns to me via email. I'd love to hear for you. You can email me there at kmccullough@omag.org. Again, today's broadcast is a cooperative effort brought to you by the Oklahoma Municipal Assurance Group, the Oklahoma Association of Chiefs of Police, and the Oklahoma Municipal Management Services. You can learn more about OMAG, OACP, and OMMS by visiting our websites at omag.org, okchiefs.org, and okmms.org. And just a reminder that this training will be reported to CLEET, and the roster would be submitted electronically in a timely manner. I appreciate the time that you've spent with us today. Please be safe, and I certainly look forward to our time with you in the future.